Hello, everyone. Are we live? I hear a little bit of an echo, John. I'm not sure why. And I apologize, everyone. We were having a mic issue. If something happens to my mic, I'll run over and join John. There is an echo coming out of your computer. Can you turn, do you know why? Do you have the echo on? The echo
No,
cancellation?
no, I don't think so.
So go to setting
Okay.
and then go to audio.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have echo cancellation marked?
I do now.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yes, much better. Thanks, babe.
Okay.
Dr. Babe. Sorry. We're glad to have you
Okay.
back. Hello,
Yep.
everyone.
Glad to be back.
Back by popular demand. First off, I just want to say thank you to everyone coming. I know a lot of people thought that we'd be covering the Daybell case tonight, especially with all the motions. But the truth is, I am not an attorney. Dr. John is not an attorney. We are a journalist and a forensic psychologist. And one question that we have been asked over and over again since the beginning of this tragedy is, could we talk about the Eliza Fletcher case, the murder of the Memphis mother who was running early in the morning and was kidnapped and murdered. It's a case we've been following closely from the beginning. I know that this week the cause of death was determined, that she was shot in the back of the head and also suffered from blunt force trauma. It's a heartbreaking story, and we felt that it was finally time to talk about this case from a forensic psychologist perspective, and we hope that people here can feel like they can ask John questions as well. So if you are subscribed to our channel, which is free, some people get confused by that. It just means hitting our subscribe button on our YouTube channel. You can join the live chat and you can ask your questions. I also want to give a very special thank you to my moderators today. They are incredible women who do this out of the love of their hearts. I know that our beloved moderator, Colette, is we don't talk about it, but she has a very successful, incredible career. She does this again as a kindness and a friendship, and I know that soon she'll be taking on some new roles, and we are going to lose her here. So a big thank you to Colette and all she does. And if you want more of Colette, you can head to True Crime Underground, Lori Daybell, Cult Mom, a Facebook group that talks about the Daybell case. And then if you want to hear other cases, I know they covered the Eliza Fletcher case as well. You can head to True Crime Underground and join their main page for other groups. I know that she does that also out of the goodness of her heart. So, John, you have a huge smile on your face. I can tell you're happy.
Which would be unusual
Resting
because
bitch face. Oh, excuse me. Sorry.
yeah, would be unusual because I usually don't have a huge smile. But I'm happy to be here, and I welcome everybody who's joining us.
Yes, and thank you to those who requested John talk about this. I have a cough officially today. I feels like just a couple months ago I got over bronchitis that I dealt with for 6 months. This is new today. I'll probably try to put it on mute quite a bit. And John, do you mind taking over if I have any issues, if that's okay, babe?
Sure.
If everyone could give this video a like and please subscribe to our channel, that would mean so much. Thank you. With that being said, let's talk about this case. For those, hold on. For those unfamiliar with this case, and I don't think that there are many unfamiliar with this case because it is one of those crimes that I think affects so many of us, because I think we all feel that we could be Eliza Fletcher. She was a young mother of two, kindergarten or pre-K teacher, out for early morning run. I think she had qualified for the Boston Marathon and was an athlete, and she was violently kidnapped, grabbed, put into a car, and her life ended. She was sexually assaulted and murdered. And I think that for women that find themselves also intrigued with true crime, and tell me if you feel I'm right, John. I think this is one reason, is because I think we can all relate to this random act of crime. And Eliza was one of us. Eliza listened to true crime podcasts. That was one of her things she enjoyed doing. And I think we all can feel a bit of us in Eliza, that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And, her little boys now will grow up without a mother, and, her preschool children won't have her anymore. So thank you for talking about this. I think one of the major questions we've been getting actually is about the perpetrator, the person who did this heinous act. And why don't you take it away, John?
Yeah. So let me just say, first of all, that just like Daybell, there's been no convictions. There's been an arrest. The case is ongoing. There's been no trial. I don't know if it's going to go to trial. It may just be a plea deal, but my guess is that the offender seems like he would more than likely resist a plea deal. In the past, when he abducted an attorney, he was offered a plea deal and he resisted that for a year. The evidence was overwhelming, but he refused a plea deal because, as the attorney said, he was exhibiting what he called jailhouse braggadocio, which would suggest that there's some narcissism, some defiance, some rebelliousness, and all that, by the way, would be consistent with potential antisocial traits. But let me just preface everything by saying that, like Daybell, that he's innocent until proven guilty, and this case hasn't gone to trial, and so this is pure speculation. There does seem to be a lot of evidence that implicates him, but we don't know for sure, and he hasn't been convicted of anything yet. So we should preface our episode, or our session tonight, with that.
He has been charged, but innocent until proven guilty.
Right. So do we know definitively that he's the perpetrator here? I guess not, but I mean, it certainly seems like there's a lot of evidence. There's video evidence, there's physical evidence, there's a lot of evidence linking into this crime. But so I don't want to focus on the evidence so much as his history, which his history begins at age 11. He commits his first crime at age 11, and then between 11 and 16 years old, he has 16 different offenses. Many of them are aggravated assault with a weapon. He engaged in a rape during that period of time. He has an extensive criminal history going back to the very earliest years of his childhood. He's a repeat offender, obviously, many, many times over. At 16, he abducts an attorney. Kemper Durand is his name. He places him in the back of his car in the trunk. He drives around town with this attorney in his trunk. The attorney's fairly well convinced that he's going to die. He gets the attorney out of the trunk. He takes him to an ATM machine. He forces him to withdraw money. Just coincidentally, they're at the gas station where he's withdrawing money, and he sees a security guard and he screams for help, and he escapes. He says, in The Attorney Who's Abducted, he says in 2003, when there was a motion to revisit the case, that he was convinced he was going to die, and that the defendant, who was Cleotha, was he lacked any type of remorse. So in 2000, after the abduction of the attorney Kemper, he is sentenced to 24 years. He serves 20 of those years. He's released roughly 2019-20, and so he does about 85% of his time. And then fairly quickly, he starts engaging in other crimes, theft, identity theft. We now know that he raped someone in 2021, violently raped her, and that she was afraid for her life too. He put a gun to her head, which was his MO for Eliza. So this is someone who he engages the same behavior over and over, beginning when he's roughly 11, 12 years old. So, there were many ways that this could have been prevented. I think, obviously, if the rape kit was expedited and they linked it to him, they would have arrested him. If they even
And Eliza would still be alive. That
Yeah.
makes me so angry.
Even the day before, when he stole money and it was reported, if the police had arrested him or tied it to him, they could have prevented the murder. So this is a career criminal with a history of violence. His risk for reoffense is, from a forensic standpoint, it was and continues to be extremely high. Obviously, now he's never probably going to get out of prison. I'm not sure if Tennessee has a death penalty, but he may be subjected to the death penalty. So I think his criminal career is over. But the sad part is that I guess the big question that we get is, should he have been released in 2020? And were there some warning signs here that would have allowed us or that would have prevented this from occurring?
Those are two of the questions we've received.
Right. So we've talked a little bit about other juvenile offenders. We've talked about Aiden Fucci, who he murdered
Tristan Bailey.
Tristan Bailey. I believe she was about the same age. Aiden was 14.
She was 13, 12
she
or
was
13.
13. He stabbed her well over 100 times. It was clearly very premeditated. The question, I think, with a 14-year-old is always, from a forensic standpoint, can that person be rehabilitated? And if somebody commits such a heinous crime at the age of 14, should they spend the rest of their life in prison? And there's actually a case called Miller's. It was Miller versus Alabama in 2012, that the Supreme Court ruled essentially that it would be cruel and unusual punishment to sentence a juvenile, especially a juvenile 14 and under, so a young juvenile, to lifetime without the possibility of parole at such an early age, right? And so the Supreme Court actually, in Miller, it became known as Miller's Law. The Supreme Court in that case essentially said that every young juvenile should have a second chance. It doesn't mean they're going to be released. It just means that they should have a chance to be reevaluated at some point when they're an adult or when they're up for parole, so that they don't necessarily have to spend the rest of their life in prison. So part of that is the recognition that a 14-year-old is a more likely candidate or a better candidate for rehabilitation than a 40-year-old. So Abston, or Cleotha Abston, who committed this crime, is 38, right? So with a criminal career beginning at age 11 and continuing until he's basically 40, you'd have to say that the possibility of rehabilitation is zero. So, or maybe 1%, I don't know. But I mean, it's going to be next to nothing. So in 2016, in Montgomery versus Louisiana, the Supreme Court upheld their decision in Miller versus Alabama and agreed that young adolescents should have a second chance, that they should at least have the ability to be considered for release and to be reevaluated when they're adults and they spend time in prison. And so that was reaffirmed in 2016. And then in 2021, there was a case, Brett Jones versus Mississippi, which I'm well aware of because it's so recent, that Jones versus Mississippi essentially overturned Miller and Montgomery and said that it's not necessarily the case, that it's not unreasonable to hold young juveniles in prison for their entire lives without some type of further review or reconsideration of release. So the current stance in this country is, and there's exceptions by state, but the current stance is that it's acceptable to, it's not cruel and unusual. It's would be normal practice and acceptable to hold a 14-year-old like Aiden Fucci in prison without the possibility of parole and with minimal review or minimal reconsideration of any type of release. So I think the question, for me at least, in this particular case with Abston, Cleo Abston, who's the offender, one question I would have is, should he have received a longer sentence? Should he have been given, as a 16-year-old, life without the possibility of parole? Was his risk sufficiently high? Is it possible to evaluate a 16-year-old and say that his risks at that point were sufficiently high that he would pose a risk to the community even after serving a 20-year sentence? Right. And I think in hindsight, it's always easy to say, yeah, of course, there were a lot of warning signs, right? But I don't know. It's not really giving due consideration to his age and the consideration that a 16-year-old is a better candidate for rehabilitation than a 40-year-old. So I think it's a complicated question, and it remains a complicated question. And the Supreme Court has obviously struggled with it. With Miller, they believed it was cruel and unusual to sentence a adolescent for life without parole, and then more recently with Jones, they disagreed. So I don't know. There's not a simple answer.
I think well, I mean, at what point does a psychologist or a psychiatrist say, you know what, this juvenile is a psychopath, and that's that? I mean, how many crimes does one have to commit as a juvenile? Severe crimes, violent crimes,
Right.
before they realize that this isn't going to get better.
Well, and there's another element here too, which is that his father, who's also Cleo, his father is Cleo Henderson. His father is basically in prison for the rest of his life too. He was convicted of second-degree murder. I don't exactly know the date, but I do know that when Cleo Abston was 16 and sentenced, his father was in prison at that time. And his father continues to be in prison, and his father was given a 40-year sentence. So, that there is the belief, and this is supported by research, that psychopathy, which would be the worst possible diagnosis for a criminal, that if you're deemed to be a psychopath, there's more than likely a genetic component. So with his father, I mean, you could argue that there's socioeconomic reasons as well, poverty, yes. Right? There's a lot of other reasons that come into play here. But one of the variables I think that would have to be looked at very closely with his father in play, and his father being a career criminal as well, is the possibility that there's some genetic propensity towards violence and crime. And I know there's probably a lot of sociologists that might disagree with that, but Adrian Raine is a psychologist who's done a tremendous amount of research on the genetic biological components of violence, and he would say without question that because his father is a career criminal, that there's some biological component. We wouldn't know exactly what the percentage is, but it's there. That's what he would argue, I think. So for those interested in that, Adrian Raine's work, by the way, is fairly complicated, but it's interesting, and that's his argument.
We recorded a dinner table conversation last night, John, for our Patreon members, which was going to be shared today, except that I have been sick. So I got behind to do some editing. But you mentioned a study in there about psychopaths that I had not heard before. Is that relevant to this? Would that kind of explain why, if someone is deemed a psychopath, as far as recidivism goes and next chances, it's concerning.
Yeah, I think so.
Really quickly
It's
though, but before, thank you, Anna, so much for your support here tonight. Thank you. We're always grateful to have Dr. John here. He's here by popular demand. People have been asking for more John and mad that he only shows up at in Patreon. So thank you, Anna, so much.
yeah. So there's a little known obscure study or experiment that was conducted in the 60s and 70s at a place in Ontario, Canada called Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge is a psychiatric facility, and there was a guy there by the name of Elliot Barker, who was the psychiatrist that overseed all their programs. And Barker was interested in taking the most severe criminal offenders and subjecting them to unusual types of treatments. And back in the 60s, that would have been like encounter groups. So I don't know. I don't know how familiar people our viewers are with encounter groups, but encounter groups were essentially these group sessions that were marathon sessions that would go on for days and days and days. Oftentimes the clients would be naked. And the reason for that is because it was believed that when you're naked, you're more vulnerable. And the purpose of an encounter group is to kind of break down a person's defenses so that they can address their issues more openly, or they can address more emotionally sensitive issues in an open manner. And so Barker took a group of psychopaths and put them in these encounter groups, sometimes for up to 2 weeks, with occasion, they were fed, but they were essentially in the same room. They were allowed to go to the bathroom, obviously, but it was a really restrictive environment. And they were naked during most of these sessions. They were engaged in these activities that included shouting and screaming. And there was, by the way, a type of therapy in the 60s and 70s called primal scream therapy, which was basically just having a client scream at the top of their lungs and to try to, I guess, it was a type of cathartic treatment to get clients to, I guess, to expel all of their rage. I guess that was the idea. It was actually a type of rebirthing, that if there was, I forget the guy's name. I think it was like Irvin Janis, I believe, was the guy who's founded Primal Scream. But anyway, a lot of these encounter groups would engage in a type of primal scream. So there was a lot of screaming and yelling and crying. And I mean, it was just a kind of a free for all. But the goal was to break down the defenses of the psychopaths so that they could be more emotionally vulnerable to each other, and they could learn to identify and express their emotions, which, by the way, is so going back to Robert Hare, who was one of the lead researchers on psychopathy in the 60s. Hare had this idea that most psychopaths had emotional deficits, that they couldn't feel or express emotions, including empathy. They had no remorse. And so it made sense to Barker, based on Hare's research about the lack of emotionality in psychopaths, to try to get them to deal with their emotions. And so he would put them in these they called them encounter capsules, but he'd put them in these capsules for days on end, naked, with these ridiculous activities where they were screaming and yelling at each other and crying. And but he also introduced something else into the capsules, which is now, oddly enough, becoming more mainstream, which was psychedelic assisted treatment. So he would give some of these psychopaths LSD and psilocybin and various hallucinogenics to try to break through the defenses as well, which, when strangely enough, that's become more mainstream and it's become more adopted and scientifically viable these days. Not the way they did it back then, by the way. Like back then, there was no controls over it. Nowadays, it's done in a very controlled way with a therapist in the room and that kind of thing. back then he was just, I don't know. I don't think he talked about the exact dosage of LSD, but he was giving them LSD. And again, the goal was to get them to kind of change their consciousness and to break through those defenses so that they could have a religious experience and they could see reality differently. So Barker did this for like 10 or 15 years. And over time, a number of these psychopaths, believe it or not, and these were murderers. We're talking about the most violent psychopaths in Canada who were staying there at the hospital. As they were released into the community, they started to reoffend. And not only did they reoffend, many of them went on to commit murder again. In fact, when they went back and looked at the statistics of how this type of treatment worked, 80% of the psychopaths who were released in the community committed some type of reoffense. Most of those were violent reoffenses. A small percentage or a decent percentage were murders. So, so this was an abysmal type of treatment with horrible results. And I think, to me, it shows to some degree the limitations of trying to treat a psychopath. That if a psychopath can't feel and can't express remorse or has no emotions, and you subject them to these types of treatments that are trying to get to that very issue, and then they come out a lot worse once you've had them deal with their emotions. You know, I mean, first of all, the treatment itself is suspect, but secondly, I think it shows the limitations of any type of treatment with a psychopath and any type of ability to affect long-term change with a psychopath. So, and Hare, by the way, Robert Hare, who Hare's H-A-R-E, Hare knew about this experiment and just laughed at it. You know, when Hare learned about the results, he just shook his head and said, "Of course, what do you expect? These are psychopaths, or they're not going to change." I mean, what was not expected was that a lot of these psychopaths would be released into the community and go kill again, and that obviously was tragic. So this isn't a well-known experiment. It was a totally bungled experiment, right? But it's a fascinating experiment to me because I think it shows the limitations of psychopaths and treating them, and it raises the question about whether you can rehabilitate a psychopath. So, and there's a lot of debates about that. A lot of people would argue that you can't. And right. I think if you look at a guy like Cleotha Abston and his criminal history and the fact that he began committing crimes when he was 11, serious crimes, violent crimes, rape, when he was really young. When you look at that and you look at what he did recently, obviously, with Eliza, I think you'd have to really question whether somebody like that should ever be released. And I know that, you know, it's a really difficult thing to say to a 16-year-old, you should be in prison the rest of your life. There's no chance of rehabilitation. But maybe in some cases, that's the best approach.
That brings us to a question by Stephanie Budge, and we're getting some great questions. Suzanne Freeman, I saw yours too. I want you to know that. And a big thank you to Moonlight View for your kind donation. Stephanie Budge asked, can children be diagnosed as psychopaths? Because that is they can. So I didn't know that either. I thought
there's a woman named Essie Viding who is in England, and she's done a lot of research on childhood psychopathy and shown that psychopathy, I mean, we want to be careful with that, but that psychopathy some children do show psychopathic traits, and it does exist in children.
But you want to be careful because
right.
I mean, for the most part, isn't it best practice to not diagnose a personality disorder until adulthood?
Well, psychopathy, believe it or not, psychopathy is not actually a diagnosis in the DSM. So the only way you could diagnose it in the DSM would be you'd have to call it antisocial personality disorder. Robert Harris fought for years to have it included as a diagnosis, but which is true that, antisocial personality disorder cannot technically be diagnosed until 18 years old, but one of the precursors of antisocial personality disorder is conduct disorder, which is essentially a version of antipersonality disorder for kids or adolescents. So you could diagnose someone with conduct disorder, which I'm quite sure, I'd be 98% sure, was probably something that Cleotha Abston was diagnosed with. And again, that's speculation. I haven't met him. I haven't seen his records. So I don't know if that was a diagnosis he received, but you'd have to think that beginning in criminal activities at age 11 until 16 and abducting people and threatening to kill them and rape, you'd have to, my guess is he meets criteria for conduct disorder.
So that makes me ask, that takes us to Suzanne Freeman's question. And then I want to bring up something that's going on in chat too. So in chat, a lot of people are asking about oppositional defiant disorder and thinking that that was perhaps what you call someone until they're 18, a psychopath. But you're mentioning that this is not even something that's diagnosed in the DSM. And then Suzanne Freeman, by the way, Suzanne is the Suzanne Freeman who we interviewed recently. That her 2-part interview is on our channel. It's been well received. If you haven't seen that, definitely check that out. She was a good friend, keyword was, a good friend of Chad Daybell. Chad Daybell was her publisher. She is asking, what is the difference between borderline personality disorder and psychopathy? So a couple of things going on in chat here.
So borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder are part of a cluster of personality disorders in the DSM-5, now the DSM-5 TR, temporary revision, but psychopathy is not included in the DSM. It's not technically a diagnosis that would be used officially based upon the DSM. It would be more of a informal diagnosis, although I think the DSM is moving more in the direction of seeing it as a valid diagnosis. And it would be closely associated, as I said, it would be closely associated with antisocial personality disorder. But borderline personality disorder, there's a lot of overlap in cluster B. These are all part of cluster B personality disorders. There's a great deal of overlap between these diagnoses. So, for example, lack of empathy would be a common element to many of these, that antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorders in that cluster, histrionic personality disorder. There tends to be a lack of empathy among most personality disorders in that cluster. Borderline is a little different in the sense that it's characterized more by instability than it is by, say, antisocial behaviors. But to answer the question, psychopathy is probably the most extreme. If psychopathy was a diagnosis in the DSM, it would definitely be considered, I think, the most extreme diagnosis.
Thank you. And did we answer the thing about oppositional? We did. Defiant disorder. People are
This
discussing.
is an interesting question, by the way, about his mother.
Yes, let's. I thought you might want to talk about that. Fee and me, thank you so much for your kind support that just came in. I see that. Thank you so much. Yeah, so Finka asks, his mother seems to think the system really did him wrong, but she also wants to believe that her child didn't do this and that her child was set up in the past. That is a fascinating part of this case. Such a heinous crime, not just such a heinous crime, but such a heinous history. And the mother is saying, no.
Yeah, my response to that would be, I've worked with a lot of juvenile offenders over the years, and I would say that I can't tell you the number of families who deny that their child did anything. It's amazing. When I do an evaluation of a juvenile offender or sex offender or violent criminal or a juvenile accused of a violent crime, I would say at least half of the family, and so I have to interview the parents or one or the other of the parents, preferably both, but I can't tell you the number of times that the parents will deny that anything happened and blame it on someone else. And they simply, and by adopting that stance, by the way, they're not helping their child. because this is a time when the child can get help. So if a juvenile commits a sex crime and they're totally in denial, what happens is the juvenile adopts that stance and says, well, I didn't do anything. Clearly I'm being railroaded, right? And so the possibility, that window for therapeutic intervention starts to close. If the parents won't acknowledge it and the child won't acknowledge it, then treatment's going to be ineffective. It's going to get the child nowhere. So I think it's not atypical that the mother, I know he's not a juvenile, but it's not atypical that the mother would see it that way, because I think it's very painful to acknowledge that your son engaged in this horrendous behavior and needlessly killed someone, murdered.
It looks
She's
like
going to do everything she can to blame anyone else but herself.
Right. I'm finding a couple of other questions that I wanted, and I passed them. It's starting to go a little bit faster. Oh, Kathy. I wanted to ask Kathy's question. What about people that are brought up with good parents and still become violent or a menace to society?
Yeah, it happens. In those cases, I think there's probably maybe more of a genetic component and probably much more of a peer influence. So I think peers and friends obviously have a tremendous impact on juveniles. In fact, there's some research. There was a book about school shooters released in like 2004. I forget the authors, but the title of the book is Rampage. And it's qualitative research, so it's interesting research, but it's a little different research. It's not experimental per se, which would be really hard to do with school shooters, by the way. So I think qualitative research is the best kind of research you're probably going to get. But their argument is that most school shootings have something to do with peer pressure and peer influence. And so you can have really excellent parenting, I think, and if a child falls in with the wrong crowd or is influenced by really negative peers, things can go bad quickly there too. So and there might be some type of a genetic propensity towards a lack of empathy, or maybe the family wasn't necessarily very good with expressing or coping with emotions. I think that would contribute to problems too. But peers have an enormous influence, and no doubt that can lead to criminality too.
This question from Anna, I'm going further back into the chat because I saw all of these early on and I thought, oh, I've got to remember these. I started writing them down. But Anna C asks, aren't we all born narcissists, and it's unlearning that brings us to being good members of society?
It's
an interesting way to put it.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'd use the term narcissist, but yeah, I think basically that's true. Yes. I think, in fact, if you consider like the basic Freudian model of human behavior, Freud's essential idea was that we're born aggressive sexual creatures with primarily dominated by what he called the drives, which means instinct, and that we spend our whole lives essentially trying to become tamed by society, by civilization. And he wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, where he argued that basically what you're saying. He argued that we're all very narcissistic and we're all driven by instinct and by our own wants and desires and needs when we're little. That's a question of survival, because we need to eat and we need contact. And so I think, yes, we're all narcissistic to a large degree when we're small, but then society and our communities and culture tries to shape us. It tries to get us to conform to social norms, and most of us don't like that. And so some people like it less than others, by the way, and those people are the ones that have more problems. But I think one of the reasons Freud was so controversial and has been controversial over the years is because his basic premise was that human beings are self-centered creatures who society tries to shape, and we don't like that. And so I think there's been a lot of people that kind of see Freud as someone who, you know, someone who is a little controversial.
Yes. Although I've learned to like Freud a lot more since having a child. I'm like, okay, I get it. Stephanie Budge, thanks for reminding everyone to show their support for Hidden True Crime by hitting the like button, sharing, and subscribing to this channel. Thanks for that reminder. It means a lot. And Suzanne Freeman is saying, and if an adult told me that my child did something, I would believe the adult. Yes. I always find it interesting when parents do believe sometimes that their child did something. I think that's good. Artsy Cat, by the way, says for her it was the opposite. Rather than her parents, it was good friends and their parents and her friends' parents as role models that saved her. And I'm grateful for that. Yeah, a healthy degree of narcissism for each age. Sarah Adams, exactly.
Which, yeah, right. That's a good point. There's the other side of that is when you have a child in a really dysfunctional family, one of the elements that creates resiliency is to find an adult who's a supportive adult and a mentor, maybe a teacher, maybe a neighbor. That is undoubtedly the biggest variable that will assist a child in a very difficult situation, is to find an adult mentor who's supportive and nurturing and can help that child see beyond or past their family dysfunction.
Jennifer Long, so glad that you're grateful we're covering this case. It's something we have been wanting to cover, and while we're going on a bit of a tangent, it's all about this case and what makes this happen again and again. Such a heartbreaking case. Tallulah is asking, why was schizoaffective disorder omitted from the DSM? Is that something you want to mention?
As far as I know, it's still in the DSM. I believe that it was applied to Lori.
Well, didn't you say though that schizophrenia is, but the schizo or late? I thought that there was something about that, but maybe I'm wrong. Well, schizoaffective disorder.
There was a change from the way the psychoses were seen, or the way they were categorized. That schizophrenia is now seen more on a spectrum, just like autism. So it's changed the way it's viewed, but not. I think there's still a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder.
Thank you. I actually want to bring this up because this is something you and I talk about at home. Stephanie said that while I have not read Rampage, I feel a book written 17 years ago, the research is far from up to date. That is something we discussed. Do you want to mention?
Yeah. When it comes to, that's a good point. My argument, that's true to some degree, but I think you have to consider the nature of social science research, which is that a lot of things in human beings don't change that dramatically over time. Technology changes rapidly, but human beings are not like that. I think some of the core issues that drive humans don't change a lot, and they haven't changed, if you go back in the history of Western literature or philosophy and you look at some of the great ideas, we're still driven by many of the same elements, many of the same conflicts. Jealousy existed 2,000 years ago. It exists now. Shakespeare wrote about it, obviously, in Othello. It drives a lot of homicides. So, and domestic violence disputes. So 17 years, I mean, is the research outdated? Not if you believe that some of the underlying motivations that drive us, including peer pressure for adolescents, if you think that's relevant, then I'd say the research is still relevant.
Thank you. Somebody mentioned Josh Duggar. And Julie Holden, I don't know if you have the link, but we do have a couple of Patreon episodes about Josh Duggar with Dr. John. And then I also have a separate podcast about him on our YouTube channel without you, John, with our good friend Karen Michelle, who is on our channel often. Her insight, because she grew up in a similar environment as the Duggars. So one thing I want to talk about, though, that makes me really upset. I mean, this Eliza, let's back to Eliza Fletcher. You know, it's this absolute tragedy. And the thing, I mean, everything makes me angry. The fact that this person had such a history, but in 2021, he violently raped a woman. She's come forward now because what happened is the rape kit was processed right after Eliza was kidnapped and killed. And it came back that it was him. And the victim has now come forward. I don't have her name on me, but you can Google that and find her. She's speaking out. And she said she met him on a dating app. He held a gun to her head. She didn't think that she was going to survive. They met at an abandoned house that he claimed that he was the manager over. They were going to go from there on their first date, but instead he assaulted her. She had a rape kit done. I mean, this is a violent rape that she's lucky to be alive from, clearly. And they didn't process the rape kit for over a year and get his name in the system. And had they, he would have been behind bars and Liza would be alive. I think that to me is one of the most maddening things about this. And I think one thing that's so maddening is you see this again and again and again. I don't know if you have anything to say about that. I'm venting. I have no answers. But why? Why does that happen over and over again?
The short answer is you're dealing with bureaucracies, which bureaucracies obviously have different ways of doing business and different rules and regs. And my guess is it probably got tied up in red tape. We know now that the rape kit wasn't expedited. If it had been expedited, they would have arrested him, and yes, she'd be alive. Why it wasn't expedited, I don't know. Was that a function of something to do with their bureaucracy? I mean, unfortunately, law enforcement organizations are not lean organizations. I'm not being critical of law enforcement, but they're bureaucracies and they have a lot of rules and regs and they abide by those. And I don't know, things get lost in the shuffle. So it probably depends on the individual agency, but my guess it had something to do with red tape or something in the bureaucracy that prevented it from being processed faster. And I don't know what that was or is.
Yeah. As Snicker says, thousands of those kits are still sitting on the shelves. And it's true what you said. There's no one person to blame. It is about a bureaucracy. I know that the town that John and I used to live, they made an effort to make sure that they had no rape kit sitting on a shelf, and they put funding towards that specific cause. And, you know, I hope that people can understand how important those are, that they save lives, and that, you know, this happens again and again. So, yeah. Someone saying she came forward because Eliza died. Yeah.
Some of it would depend upon the culture of the organization. If it's a culture that takes domestic violence seriously and takes assaults against women seriously, then they're probably processed faster. If it's an organization that doesn't value that, then they're going to put their resources elsewhere. So some of it has to do with the organizational culture and what they value and where they're putting their resources.
Yeah. Kelly says, similar to Charles Vallow, the system failed him. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, like we're talking about bureaucracies that have their ways of doing business and they're very difficult to change. They're hard to move. They're hard to, sometimes, you know, they tend to be a little inert. They're hard to get any movement within.
Thank you, Stephanie Budge and Julie Holden, our wonderful mods who are sharing some links to those Duggar podcasts. You can find those in chat if you're watching this later head to the live chat to find those. And Michelle, thank you for always coming here and reminding people to hit that like button and to subscribe. Suzanne Freeman, you're so right. If a person can rape, they can kill also. And Julie Holden's mentioning Gabby Petito as well. So what else do you want to say about this tragedy, John? We're receiving a lot of questions, and I want, well, before I ask you a question, and then I'm gonna say, wait, I'm gonna interrupt you. I also want people to know that John and I last night did record a Patreon episode that I find fascinating. I actually said, with John sitting at the table, I've lived with you for years and I'm having some aha moments here. It was wonderful. We also talked about Putin. And then we talked about psychopathy. And so a lot of the questions here, if you're on Patreon, that will be posted in the next day or two. With that being said, babe, yes. What else would you like to say? And then I have a couple things. We have a babysitter tonight, so we have to, we can't be on here too long.
I think if there's some questions, that would be the way to go. But I think the big question here is what to do with a teenager with a criminal history like Cleo Abston. And there's this moral issue about second chances, right? Like, I think in this country, for the most part, I think we believe in redemption and second chances, and I don't know, right? So it's I don't have an answer, but it's disheartening to think that if he was sentenced to more time or maybe even life without parole, and we couldn't know at the time of his release, obviously, that he was going to kill someone else in such a heinous fashion. But if the system made a different decision when he was 16, then we wouldn't be confronting this either. And it's a heavy question. I don't have an answer, but what do we do with adolescents who clearly have some extremely violent tendencies and some features of psychopathy? And do we lock them up and throw away the key? Do we give them another chance? I don't know. It's a really, really difficult dilemma.
Thank you. One thing,
and I want to agree with Sarah, by the way, that his juvenile record was terrifying. Yeah, it was terrifying. When you're raping, when you're assaulting people with a weapon and raping them at 14 years old, that's a problem. If I'm doing that evaluation when he's 14 or 15, yes, I'm going to struggle with the fact that he's a child, but the nature of those crimes is so severe. I think you'd have to say his risk is going to be high for his entire life. His risk of reoffense, his risk of future violence, his risk of future rapes. I really think you'd have to argue that at 14, as hard as it is, I think you'd have to say this is someone who's going to be a high risk the rest of his life, and the system needs to manage that. If you do release him, even if it's at 38, I think you need to really put some monitors on this guy, meaning like maybe an ankle bracelet. I mean, I know he would argue against that, or his attorney would argue against that and say essentially, well, he did his time. He served his time. Now you can't put further restrictions on him, right? And that's what sex offenders say, by the way. Most sex offenders are subjected to what's called lifetime supervision, which means they don't ever get off of supervision completely. They can eventually, but when they're released and they do all their time, they're still put on supervision and monitored very closely, because many of them, the premise is that many of them still have those same propensities towards sex crimes, and they're not rehabilitated. And so the system monitors those people very closely. So,
it's good to see Michael Fitzgerald, PhD, here again. Thank you for coming here, Michael. We're honored to have you as a listener. With all that being said, again, we've been requested. Some people are asking about other crimes. I want to say that is true. If you have ideas about other crimes, write to hiddentruecrimeinfo@gmail.com. We're covering Eliza today because we've been asked by many of our listeners to cover Eliza, and we are taking those ideas. So thank you to those who are always suggesting crimes and questions for us. I just want to again say, for me, the Eliza Fletcher case, I think, hit many of us that follow true crime stories or just simply the news as an absolutely terrifying thing, because it's so, being at the wrong place at the wrong time. He violently kidnapped her again. I mean, she didn't have a chance. There was nothing, and she was doing what she loved best besides being with her family and teaching the children she loved. And Anna, really quickly, thank you, Anna. She just sent us a super chat. So before I conclude, let's read this. Thank you so much for your support, Anna. She said, how about mandatory parental classes for those whose kids offend?
Yeah, some states have tried that, and it's very difficult to. I know that because in Nevada, we've tried a version of that, and it's hard to get parental support. It's hard or let me put it differently, that the courts have a limited reach when it comes to mandating parental involvement, or some courts have a limited reach when mandating parental involvement in adolescent cases. I think there's a general tendency for parents to say, well, my kid did it. This wasn't my issue. I'm not responsible. So why do I have to pay the price for my kid being such a, such a problem? So it's would mandatory. I don't, so the problem is mandatory. Can you offer, parent classes to the parents of offenders, adolescent offenders? Yes, I think you can offer them, encourage them. A lot of agencies in Las Vegas, for example, try to do that, but the courts can't really mandate it. They've tried on and off over the years, but it's been largely unsuccessful, and it creates a lot of anger in parents. And when parents are angrier, they're less likely to comply with the requirements of probation or the system. So it's an interesting question. It's an interesting thought. It's been dealt with on and off, but largely unsuccessfully, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that. One thing that really touched me about Eliza was, I mean, and there's an irony too. I would like to end with this, unless there's something else you want to say, John. Are you okay?
I just want to chime in about, you talk about this being many people's greatest fear. And when I think of sort of a super predator, I don't know if that's the right term, but and I'm not sure. I think that Cleo Abston was definitely a bit of a predator in the sense that he was looking for victims. He was, with the rape in 2021, he lured the victim to an empty apartment through a dating app. And that's predatory, right? So this is clearly someone who's a predator. And when you prey on human beings, you're going to be at the very highest risk for any type of offense. But when I think of sort of a super predator, I think of Israel Keys, and I don't know if our viewers know much about Keys. Keys is someone we've looked at a lot, and we hope to do something on Keys eventually. But Keys to me is sort of that elusive predator that's in the shadows all the time, in the Walmart parking lot or in the Target at night, or just waiting for a victim. Keys literally would pick out certain jogging trails that people would frequent, mainly women, and he would sit behind the signs that that give you the details of the trails. He would sit behind signs and wait for the opportune moment to grab someone. So what I want to say is that fortunately there aren't a lot of people like that. But on the other hand, there are legitimate concerns and fears. I think the reason why we have those fears are because of people like Cleotha Abston and Israel Keys. And unfortunately, these people exist. And it's very difficult to know how to manage these types of people, obviously.
Yeah, Israel is no longer living. People are asking, but he is a recent serial killer that John always discusses as someone who did not get the media attention he likely should have. John's always saying, why are we so interested in Ted Bundy when there's Israel Keys?
Israel Keys, yeah. He lived in the short version of Keys is that he studied FBI profiling. He studied previous serial killers, including Ted Bundy. He saw Ted Bundy as a hero of sorts. And he used that information to commit his crimes and to not get caught until the very end when he made some really serious mistakes and they finally found him. But he was absolutely vicious. And the body count for Keys is unknown, but I'm sure it's astounding. I would guess it's probably well over 100 people. But many of those will never be solved. Many of those crimes will never be solved because he did kill himself. And I don't know, but he's even among serial killers, he's a bit of an anomaly.
Yeah. Right up there though with all of our biggest nightmares. Ted Bundy, Cleo, Israel Keys. Yeah, and I think the irony too is we're always talking about, or you're always talking about, the immense importance of childhood and attachment and how important it is, and that so often if we could just nurture our children, society's children, and give children stability and love, take out the nurture. I mean, I guess you still have nature, but take out the poverty and take out, the nurture aspects and take care of those, that we would see fewer crimes. We'd see fewer criminals, that society would be a safer place, a better place, a more loving place. And, and here is a woman who was doing that for future children. She had 2 toddlers, or almost, I think maybe one wasn't a toddler, but 2 very young boys. And then not only that, but she was a preschool or pre-K or kindergarten teacher. I've heard both. And the first thing we heard about her too, by the way, was that she was a billionaire's granddaughter, right? An heiress. And so, and then you see videos of her and you realize that she was working, and clearly she did this out of the love of her heart. She taught these children. And so I find it extra heartbreaking that not only did he take a life because of likely his upbringing and his bad childhood, but he took away a nurture from other children. It's just sad. And for me, one thing that we tweeted out, our Twitter, by the way, if you don't follow our Twitter, it's hidden crime. Hidden true crime didn't fit. So it's at hidden crime. We posted this video of Eliza Fletcher singing "This Little Light of Mine, I'm going to let it shine" to her preschool or kindergarten students. And I thought that I wanted to share that here, if that's okay. And oddly, it reminded me how much I love the song. And I started singing it to my little boy after I heard her singing it. And it's been really sweet. And have you noticed that, John? Banks has been going around singing "This Little Light of Mine." It's because of Liza. Yeah. So I think that to end this, I hope that we can all let our light shine and think of maybe just give that extra nurturing to some children and in memory of Eliza, to let our light shine. So I'm gonna play this.
Before you play that, I would like to. I noticed that the school where she taught, they did a tribute to her, and there was a book that she liked to read, and they had a quote from that book, which really touched me. By the way, it's so simple, but I read it and I was quite moved by it, and I would just like to read. So this was something that Eliza read to her children, and it was something that was posted by her school. It's from a book called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. It's by Charlie McKeesey. The quote is, "We don't know about tomorrow," said the horse. "All we need to know is that we love each other." And, I thought, it's so simple, but it's so beautiful. And she loved that book. And I think I love that lesson about, we don't know about tomorrow. We just talked about Putin, and I feel like our world is probably at the gravest risk we've been in maybe ever, with Putin being so unhinged at the moment. And I just saw an article last night by a nuclear weapons expert who said essentially he's scared to death. In assessing the situation, he believes that we're on the cusp of a potential. I mean, I hope we're not. But my point is, we can't control it, and we don't know about tomorrow. So what we have is each other right now, and the best we can do is love each other. And I feel like Eliza's a tragic loss, but she made a difference in her life, and she seemed to love a lot of people, and that counts.
Thank you, babe. I appreciate that. Let's hope that this works, by the way. I put this video here and I practiced, but let me know if you can hear it okay and everything. Let's see.
Hey girls, it's Miss Fletcher. So before we go, I wanted to remind you of something that we do at St. Mary's that's so special and that I miss a lot. So I want to see if you can join in with me. We're going to sing This Little Light of Mine. Okay? Ready? This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Hide it under a bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine. Hide it under a bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Shine all over St. Mary's School, I'm gonna let it shine. Shine all over St. Mary's School, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Miss you girls. Now you need to let the light shine at your house, and I will see you later. But wait, 1 second. I heard somebody that you might want to meet. Janie, come here, girl. Come here, Janie. Come here, Janie. Hey, look, girls. This is Janie. And Janie is the girl in our house because there's 2 little boys and a Mr. Fletcher, and so there's just me and Jane. And I miss all of you girls so much. Bye.